So to those of you arriving at this webinar, I just want to say hello to you. Also let you know that we'll be giving it a couple more minutes for people to turn up and getting underway shortly. So my clock has just turned to 3 p.m. because I'm joining you from the UK. But good morning and good afternoon, good evening, if that's appropriate, to all of those who have joined us here today. I'm honoured to be hosting this webinar in the year-long series of data sharing seminar series for society. My name is Bruno. I am Head of Strategic Partnerships at the Cambridge Crystallographic Data Centre. But I'm here as well representing APARD, who are one of the organisations that are contributing to the organisation of this series. APARD is the International Union of Pure and Applied Chemistry. Its role is to enable the effective communication of chemistry across disciplines and within chemistry itself through the development of standards and tools and policies that enable that. And so we're very interested, obviously, in the themes of the seminar series to understand how we can help bring about culture change around data sharing within the chemical sciences for the benefit of all disciplines. We're joined in organising these seminar series by AAAS Science, the American Astronomical Society, American Geophysical Union, the American Meteorological Society, Board on Data Stewardship, Council of Scientific Society Presidents, Federation of American Societies for Experimental Biology, the Federation of Associations in Behavioral and Brain Sciences, and most recently, the American Chemical Society have joined into the mix at all. So I want to say a little bit about my background, actually, with the Cambridge Crystallographic Data Centre. We enable data sharing within the crystallographic community. And we're very blessed because we have a community who has seen for a number of years the value in sharing of data and have worked to sort of develop the tools and standards that enable this. But I know from my experiences and my involvement with APARD, as soon as you sort of move out a very sort of core discipline such as crystallography, or kind of focused disciplines such as crystallography, things start to get a little bit less coherent and a lot of challenges sort of come to the fore. And then when you extend out from outside a discipline into the sort of institutional context, you've got lots of different challenges with people coming from different backgrounds, different cultures, having different needs. And it's very much that sort of challenge that this particular seminar is going to focus on. And we're delighted to be joined today by two speakers. Toby Smith, who is Vice President for Policy at the Association of American Universities, and Philip Tarrant, who is Research Data Management Officer at the Arizona State University. And between them, I think they're going to give a big picture overview of the challenges that institutions are facing when it comes to enabling the public sharing of data, and then a deep dive into some of the ways in which perhaps one can start thinking about how to bring about the necessary culture change. So we will hear what Toby and Philip have to say. If you have comments or questions that occur to you as they're talking, please feel free to add those into the chat, but we'll save the sort of discussion until after they've both spoken. So with that, I will turn over now to Toby Smith, and for him to talk to us about the work that he's been involved in through his role at the Association of American Universities. So Toby, over to you.
And if we can, there we go. I'm going to share my screen here and get my presentation up. Let's see. Okay, can everybody see the presentation?
I certainly can.
You can, great. Well, Ian and Shelley from AGU and everybody, I really appreciate being invited to talk about what the Association of American Universities and the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities have been up to accelerate public access to research data. And I'm going to walk you through some of that. And let me just start by explaining what I hope to do here is just to give you an overview of where I want to spend the next about 10 to 15 minutes talking to you about is, first of all, why is data access important? And I know many of you, most of you do know that, but we'll go over that real quickly. I want to talk about our past AAU and APLU data access activities, and then talk about what we're up to right now and the big news that about our guide to accelerate public access to research data, which we're going to release here in a couple of weeks. I want to spend some time talking about cultural change and where we see higher ed associations, research university associations like ours fitting into that mix, but also as important are the role of scientific societies. And finally, I'll conclude with talking about challenges I see that we are going to have to overcome to really move the ball in terms of data access. So with that, first thing, I just want to make sure everybody knows who we are. The AAU represents 63 leading US research universities and 2 in Canada. It is a mix of public and privates, a few more publics than privates. And we really we not only advocate, but we try and shape institutional policies that drive and advance science on behalf of the good for society. APLU, our sister association, represents over 240 public research universities, although I want to be clear, there are 2 privates because I used to work for one of them. MIT and Cornell are also land grants, so they're members of APLU. And they also have some Canadian and Mexican institutions in APLU. So as I said, just a reminder, why do we care about public access to research data? Well, first, access will accelerate discovery and innovation. And we know that science advances through sharing, not only what we know, but what we've learned and what we don't know. And so that's important. And we want the scholarship, especially when it's paid for by taxpayers, to be utilized and to be accessible. We also know that it can help increase public trust and help increase the rigor of the science that is done. And it does that by giving other scientists the ability to check and to reproduce scientific findings. And so it also holds people accountable by making sure that the data behind publications is understood, can be reutilized, and then advance science. The last thing representing, I at AAU, one of my roles is to staff the vice presidents for research group. They come at this from a little bit of a different angle. And of course, we know there are a lot of federal requirements now for data sharing. And so their worry is, are we complying with what we need to do to stay and maintain the funding that we get from the federal government? So one of the issues is, as data management plans have come online, that I've been concerned about is, if at some point, and remember the grants go to the institution, so it is the institution that is responsible for complying with whatever is in those data management plans, even though they're often developed by faculty and principal investigators. if they come and audit, if an inspector general comes and audit, are we in a position to know that the institution is adhering to what was guaranteed in those data management plans by the faculty at the time they submitted them and were reviewed by the agency? So we want consistent policies across our campuses. One of the reasons we really got into this space. So I want to now talk a little bit about the history of how we came to really be working on this set of issues. I'll take you back to 2016. Actually, I'll take you back. A lot of this started around in response to the 2013 memo that was issued by John Holdren, who was then director of the OSTP, calling for access to the products of scientific research, including data. Of course, it also called for access and to publications, and we ended up with moving on publications, and there was a debate about should AAU get into that space. Talk about, we had the embargo period of a year. Things had kind of settled out, but it seemed in about 2016 there was a lot of angst. In fact, I was at an APLU meeting of senior research officers in the summer of that year, and there was great concern about how to ensure data access, especially after the SROs or the vice presidents for research heard from two different agencies and heard two different ways they were approaching data access. And I think that's gotten better in terms of the consistency across agencies, but there was a lot of concern. So we decided at that point we needed to pull together a public access working group. And I will just give and we did that. We had Lisa Lynch, who the provost of Brandeis University, is one of our co-chairs. Sarah Nusser, who I believe is actually online today and watching here, was the other co-chair, and she was the vice president for research at Iowa State. They led a group to really look at what can we do, and we started with that group, but looking, do we need to do something on publications? Do we, or what do we need to do on data? And the group uniformly said the real gorilla in the room right now is data access. So we should look at that. They wrote a report that was released in, I think it was November of 2017. It is online and available on the AAU website. That really covered three areas. It said what universities should be doing to ensure data access on their own campuses, what they should then be doing with other campuses, and finally it said it made some recommendations regarding federal agencies to help facilitate this and what they could do. After that, then a year or so later, we started talking about, okay, we did this nice report, that's great, but how do we actually move our institutions now to act upon this? And out of that came the idea that we could pull together teams from our universities, bring them to Washington, and perhaps do a great service. Because one of the problems on our campuses, which I'll talk about later, is it's not clear who owns this issue. There's lots of people who should be involved, but the people who should be talking to each other, from the libraries, from the provost office, from the compliance offices and the research officers, and the chief information officers office are not talking to each other. So maybe we could ask universities to pull together teams, bring them to Washington, and they get to do something they often don't get to do on campus. They talk together about how to provide data access, maybe even develop a plan. So we did that, and we encouraged those groups to stay together and keep talking, and we thought it was quite successful. But after that, so we tried to galvanize implementation through that workshop. It was funded by the NSF. We realized things were stagnating. The other thing, and they maybe weren't moving as fast as we would like them to. So that really led to this idea that we should try and now develop a guide and do some strategic planning with our institutions and continue to push on this. So we reinvited those 30 institutions that had sent teams to see how they were doing. We actually surveyed them to see what their success was in terms of those teams continuing to work on this set of issues. And then right after that, we held a national summit, and again, funded by NSF with additional support from the NIH. The whole idea of that second effort was that we would develop and work with this group of stakeholders. We had about 100 people come to Washington in February of 2020 talk about this, and we would then develop this guide. And where we just on March 16th had the second summit, we released a pre-publication of the guide, and I'm pleased to say that in about 2 weeks, we plan to release that final guide, and I hope it's a resource to all of you as well as to our institution. So let me just give you a little bit of an overview of what the guide is aimed to do. First of all, we see it aimed not necessarily at baseline faculty, although I think it could be useful, but we really see it as a resource for university administrators to try and accelerate project progress and encourage and accelerate data access. So it articulates how public access to research products really align with the missions of our institution. Why is it important to at an institutional level? But as I said, it's important to advance science, so it's important throughout at all levels. It outlines major steps that our institutions need to do to support data access. So it provides descriptions of things that can be done. It talks about initial actions, and then it most importantly provides some really good examples from other campuses. Now, we spend a lot of time at AA thinking about how we move our institutions, and I as Vice President for Policy was given the task of thinking about not only what we could do to affect federal policy, but how could we affect institutional policy and institutional change. So one of the areas we spend a lot of time trying to figure out is how do we get our faculty to actually teach better? We know that the reward system for teaching undergraduates is structured in a way and supposed to be teaching is valuable, as valuable as research, but we know sometimes that's not the case. And we've spent a lot of time trying to reform undergraduate STEM education. And in that process, we've learned some things about cultural change that are worth, they can be overlaid directly into data access, where we also have a big cultural change challenge. So this is actually from the STEM world. It's the notion of a river and how you, at an institutional level, move change. And it was developed by Adriana Kizar and Susan Elrod, this kind of river graphic. And what it talks about is you need leadership at the beginning of the kind of headwaters of the river. And then you need to make sure you're ready to move in an institution. And you need to finally institute policies. Let me just go back a second. You need to then implement policies to carry that out. So, and that means kind of starting at the beginning, developing a landscape, looking at your capacity for action, then and then looking at readiness, and then actually implementing. So let's overlay this with what we wanted to do with this guide. First of all, we wanted institutions to make a commitment to data sharing, that this is important and institutional leaders need to commit to it. It also means there needs to be some ownership and clarity in who owns the problem, and there need to be resources identified to support the institution moving forward to get them ready to implement new strategies. Then it's, what are those strategies? First of all, you need to develop an understanding of what your capabilities are. You need to survey where you have gaps. You need to design a system for supporting data access at the institutional level. And then you develop a plan for how you're going to implement it. And finally, there's the real implementation. So you need a data policy for your institution. There needs to be an understanding of the workflow for support and compliance and who's responsible. There needs to be infrastructure to support at the institutional level, and there needs to be then the capacity and training for faculty to actually do this. And that all involves clear communications and culture. So the great thing is I think we did actually do a pretty good job of reflecting and walking through those steps in the guide, which we are going to release here soon, and we've already released a pre-publication copy of it. I'm not going to walk through this in great detail. I just want to highlight some of the key pieces, which you'll see, and you can look at it and see reflected some of those things that I just mentioned that need to be done, but we're giving real examples of how institutions have done it. And so one of the things that's really key is this idea of creating some kind of a cross-institutional committee and get that up and going, and somebody needs to support it. So we hope, and we're going to target the guide at provosts and vice presidents for research and really encourage them to take ownership of this issue, convene a group, and then start on that plan of implementation. And we're showing some examples of other institutions. I think you're going to hear from Phil some of what they've done at Arizona State in response to some of what we've been pushing institutions to move to do. Then we provide other information, again, how to implement some of these things that come out and how to identify research data services, expertise. Cost is a big one on this, and we're trying to help our institutions think that through. And we don't even know how much it will cost. And so those are things that are still some issues. I'll cover that in challenges. But we conclude with a set of essential questions that institutions should be using to benchmark how they're doing in addressing this set of questions and moving down that kind of river that I laid out to really address change. Now I want to move from here and talk about the issue of culture, more on cultural change. So when we talk about cultural change that's needed to move the needle on data access or other areas where we have to change the culture to really move our institutions. And by institutions, I mean at all levels of the institution, from the very top down to the people who are the most important. That's the researchers who conduct the work and how they behave and what drives their behavior. And that means you need to understand this whole ecosystem, starting with the external context and those organizations like ours and where we fit, as well as disciplinary societies. And when it comes to data access, publishers, the repositories that exist out there. But then how do you actually impact this ecosystem to achieve change? So let me put in context where what AAU feels it can do with APLU. First, and where do we have leverage? Well, we represent between the two of us, 250 public and private research universities. We represent the presidents, though. And oftentimes, as they say, a president says a president or provost says go right, faculty go left. So it doesn't always work that we can just snap our fingers and achieve change. So, but we can convene people, and we've done that in some interesting ways. We also share best practices, and we know that our institutions are competitive. Yes, they're collaborative, but they're competitive. I call it coopetition. So we point out institutions that are doing really good work to other institutions and say, you should look at that model and you should do something similar. And we've done that with data access, partially what the guide does through pointing out, highlighting examples. Last thing on culture change, I just want to say though, is I mentioned, there is this view sometimes, if presidents would just change the P&T policies, we could change the culture. Well, presidents don't change P&T and promotion tenure and what's recognized. That happens at a department level. So it's very important to recognize top down, and just having institutional leadership and a commitment there doesn't get us where we need to be to move the needle. It's got to be multiple pressure points. This leads me to this slide, which really I think is important because it denotes where AAU can play and how we can play. We have entree into administrations. There are some interesting things. We also believe that the unit for change, and most important, where culture resides, is in the departments at our universities, whether it's a chemistry department, a physics department. That's where culture really exists, and faculty identify themselves as a member of a department, first and foremost, and a member of a discipline. And that's where the disciplinary societies really play. So we talk about strategies, we talk about top down, administrators can say you need to do this, set policies. Faculty don't need to push, up. So there's bottom up. The faculty who care about data access have to make a case for it. But at the end of the day, how do you get departments as a whole to really take this on and own it? And so we've done interesting things from the top down. We've held workshops in the STEM field where we bring department chairs. We asked the provost to invite department chairs to not a workshop on how to do more research, but a workshop on how to teach better. And that has been fascinating to do that, because if invited by the provost, the department chair will usually go to a workshop. It's a workshop hosted by AAU. We don't represent departments. You guys and the societies, who many of you are with, you have a better entree there. So you have this ability, and we talk about department, that they have if we can change what a department does, you have an ability to affect the middle out. And middle out may be the best way to achieve culture change. So how we get to that middle out? Well, I say that the societies, disciplinary societies in AAU and APLU, we're coming at it sideways in. So we're trying to affect culture. But the only way we're going to achieve real culture change is to have everybody working and pushing all the levers, bottom down, top up, middle out. And that's the way we'll make a change. So I'm going to conclude here and then turn it back to Ian. What are the challenges we've seen in doing this? Well, first of all, I've already covered this issue of leadership. Who's responsible for providing and ensuring data access on our campuses? And we're trying to push, and this is where we can use that top-down approach, our provosts and vice presidents to own it, at least convene a group, get this going, have discussions at that level, and then tell departments you'd like them to start talking at a departmental level about how they do this. We've seen examples like MIT, and I think a previous session might have highlighted some of that, where they are working and the provost has sent a directive down to departments to talk about this. Money, how do you facilitate, how much does it cost, and how do you facilitate and pay for it? That's a big issue. And who pays for it? Another one. Even if you want to do it, where are those resources going to come from on your campus, or are there federal resources that are available? Policy. We still have to work on what data to share, retain, and for how long. And that's a big issue we haven't resolved. I talked about promotion and tenure. How do you build in incentives and rewards in a structure that doesn't really have a good system for doing that, for making your data and your science open? The infrastructure we need to look at, and whose responsibility? Is it the university? Is it a discipline in some sense? And is it a federal agency that has some ownership of certain disciplines that needs to build disciplinary repositories? And is there a role, and what's the role of scientific societies in this space? Again, this gets right down to why I think disciplinary societies need to be very much involved in looking at repositories, because there are variations, I think, in the way we want to maintain certain data sets depending on the discipline that it's in. And it's going to have to be the scientists in those disciplines who determine what makes sense for a particular discipline, and then how to make it accessible for the long term. Sponsors. Still, we need increased harmonization amongst federal agencies. That's something we continue to talk to the agencies about. I think there's progress. We can continue to do more on that front. The last thing, I just put this in there because it's real and we're going to have to deal with it. And that is this pressure between securing certain types of research that might be sensitive for national security reasons or other, and making it, and keeping it private, and that which we make public. And there are some real tensions as another part of my job is dealing with some of the research security issues that are concerns and have come from the government. So with that, I'm going to conclude and turn things back to Ian. I want to thank you on behalf of not only myself, this is the whole team that's been involved in this project with AAU, APLU, as we've gone along. So Ian, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you very much indeed. And that sparked all sorts of thoughts in my head about the kind of opportunity there is for sort of concerted effort from the side, if you like, sort of like thinking about this from a disciplinary point of view, but also then what you've been talking about, that sort of administrative aspect as well, and the scope that there may well be to sort of align activities to bring in that sort of sideways pressure to help bring about that change from the middle. So thank you very much for that. So I see the slides appearing. So if you have comments, questions, please do share them in the chat. We will move on for now though and hand over to Philip, which, as Toby said, is going to talk a bit about actually putting these ideas into practice. So Philip, over to you.
Hi, good morning. Just making sure I was unmuted. Good morning. My name is Philip Tarrant. I'm the Research Data Management Officer at Arizona State University. Our main campus is based in Tempe, Arizona, which is part of the Phoenix metropolitan area. Thank you for the opportunity to come and speak to you this morning. It's still fairly early here in Arizona, and I mean that both literally and figuratively. We're on a journey to move through this research data management challenge, and we're in the relatively early stages, but we think we have a good strategy for moving forward. Just a little bit about my background. I am a technologist and a conservation biologist by background. I have spent a number of years in business, doing all sorts of things, including running business improvement projects, and that will become relevant later. And also a history of publishing data. I was an information manager for the long-term ecological research program that is NSF funded, and the co-chair of their information management committee for a number of years. So just a very quick piece of background. There's a reason why Arizona State is taking this topic seriously these days. Over the last 15 years or so, Arizona State has had one of the fastest growing research portfolios in the country, growing by over 300%. And in real terms, what that means is that between 2010 and 2020, we actually doubled our research expenditure. That is coming in at over $700 million this year. And consequently, our university president, Michael Crow, has changed the goal for 2025 from $850 million to $1 billion. So this is a topic we should think about taking seriously. And just a little timeline as far as ASU is concerned. In 2013, Toby mentioned this, the Office of Science and Technology Policy issued their memo regarding public access to results of research. That triggered an activity in Arizona. The Arizona Board of Regents, ABOR, funded a tri-university research data management effort, which I led on behalf of ASU and ABOR for a couple of years at least. And that created some dialogues and cooperative efforts. We did make progress. But the interesting thing from my perspective was those dialogues persisted beyond the end of the project. In 2018, we attended the APARD meeting that Toby mentioned. We had representatives from our university. That didn't include me at the time. I was taking care of this for one of the institutes at the university. And as a result of that, there was a decision that said we need to actually assign some dedicated resources to this. And that decision was made in cooperation with the library, and they both departments decided to assign dedicated people to this role. I was asked to take on this role because of my background in research data management and data publishing. And in 2020, both units expanded their resource commitments because they were starting to realize that this was a much larger effort than maybe they had originally considered. So there are reasons to publish. There are reasons to publish data, and studies are starting to demonstrate this. I won't read through this word for word, but there are a number of ways in which publishing research can facilitate new research, increase trust. Researchers are more likely to get credit if they publish their research data as well as their research. And the one that I always like is that we can save time. Graduate students are often the most frequent users of a professor's data as part of his lab or her lab, and effective archiving actually reduces the need to repeatedly explain to a graduate student what that is and where that is. And obviously preserving data in a structured repository means that it's likely to have extra consistency checks and formal versioning. So as I mentioned earlier, which is why this is relevant, I have a background of running business improvement projects. And so, you know, we're already doing research data management, so we need to improve what we're doing. And so what is the hardest task? And in the interest of time, I won't ask you to put into the chat which of these four you think, but we have to manage data, we have to provide technology, we have to implement and maintain processes, and we have to change behavior. And so the hardest task is actually changing behavior. These data are not real. I made them up. And if I never published this data set, you would never know that. So there's another good reason for publishing data in support of our research. But definitely, we believe that the changing behavior is one of the most challenging things. We know our researchers are busy. We know they are pulled from pillar to post. They have teaching assignments. They have research. They have reporting to be done. And so this has the potential to be just one more thing we're asking them to do. And so it's important also for us to implement the processes and provide technology. But if we can do all those things effectively, then potentially managing data becomes a much smaller challenge. So what's the first task we have to do then in that space? And we might think, well, let's go out there and change everyone's behavior. But in actual fact, the reality of the flow is more like this. As I mentioned just now, we're already managing data. We have a history of data that we have to try and control. There's legacy data, there's data still being created. And so that's something we've got to carry on doing. And even if we're doing that poorly, we still have to continue doing it. And then we need to provide technology. These days, we're generating vast volumes of data. In my experience of exploring the university's needs, I come from a life sciences background, and we see large volumes of data there, particularly genetic data. But I'm talking to colleagues in the theatre school who are now filming dance performances using the CGI techniques that the film industry uses with the little balls on the various limbs, and then analyzing that with computers to see how that works. So we're generating data in places I would not necessarily have expected us to be generating data. And then we need to implement the processes and the policies, and Toby alluded to this, that actually make sure we're meeting our requirements, we're following through on the commitments we've made to our federal funding agencies. And then we can probably really focus on changing behavior. So when I was asked to take on this role at ASU, we looked at this, we looked at the research data lifecycle. This is the one on the left is the one that I've used for several years now to describe how we want to manage our research data. And rather than trying to get down in the weeds, we started with a very high level view, and we said, there are three major components to a research data cycle. We need to plan to do the project, we need to conduct the research, and then we need to publish our results. And clearly the research community has a role throughout that process. And I work for Knowledge Enterprise, and Knowledge Enterprise at a lot of universities would be called the Office for Research, but that's the area of the university where I'm involved. And so we sat down with the library and we said, well, we know none of us can do this on our own. There's a partnership required. And we looked at the front end of the process and we said, well, either one of us could be involved there because we might be asked to provide technology support. We might be asked to help support a data management plan, help write that. And therefore we both put our hands up to be involved in that process, in that part of the process. And then for Knowledge Enterprise, we made the commitment that we would help support our researchers during the actual active research cycle. And therefore we would take responsibility to make sure that they had everything they needed to do that. And then the library, who are our experts in preservation, curation, and those activities, put their hands up to make sure that they would take care of publishing the data and preserving it over the long haul. So that was a good start for us. And that resulted in this Venn diagram, where we went down to the next layer of detail and we said, so what does that look like? Where do we have shared responsibilities? Where are we taking care of things on our own? And we acknowledged, although at this point we hadn't spent that much time talking to our research colleagues, that we knew there were some things that we would need to ask them to do as part of this exercise. That then resulted in this. This is a pretty complex graph, and I make no apology and I won't linger on it, but this is called a RACI chart. This stands for responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. And so again, we went down to the next level of detail and we said, well, if we're going to take care of this, who's actually going to be responsible and accountable for making sure it happens? Who else needs to be involved? Who do we need to tell about it? And who do we need to consult to make sure that they're on board with what we're doing? And that resulted then in a roadmap, because we felt if we were going to do these things, we needed to know how and when we might actually tackle them. And again, I won't necessarily linger on the details of this. Hopefully the slides will be available later. You can peruse it at your leisure. But we knew there were some things we would have to do together. We knew there were some decision points where maybe investment might be required, and we needed to indicate when those were. And then we put a rough timeline on that. So this is not really a project plan. This is a statement of intent. And this was completely derailed by the COVID pandemic, as you can imagine. Particularly my department was significantly distracted by providing technology support for the COVID pandemic. Just a little bit of background, Arizona State at one point was providing about a quarter to a third of the state's testing capacity. And we now provide logistics for the two largest state vaccination locations, where we're running through several thousand people each day to get vaccinated. So that was definitely a distraction. Another distraction is our landscape has just arrived, so you may hear some background noise. I apologize for that. But in terms of managing research data, something that most universities will have had and will have had for a number of years is some kind of management system that helps them manage their commitments and their financial requirements with respect to any grants that they receive. The one at ASU we refer to as the Enterprise Research Administration System. And of course, we submit our grants through that, we manage the reporting through that, we reconcile the finances associated with that. And that persists right through the life of the grant. But there's another piece to this jigsaw, and that's the Research Information Management System. And that lives over the same period of time, but it involves all the data associated with the project. And so we realized at ASU that we needed to beef up in that space. That was something that was being done ad hoc. And so back to that original graph where we said we needed to provide technology as well as process and change behavior, we made a decision to invest in some tools that would help us do this. The Research Technology Office and Knowledge Enterprise purchased an electronic, what's normally referred to as electronic lab notebook. We picked Lab Archives, which is broadly used in the university setting, and our library in their efforts to provide an institutional repository settled on Dataverse. And over the last year, we've implemented both of those products into our research information management space. And we now have data sets going into the Dataverse. We're also looking at using our institutional repository as an internal data catalog as well to share data sets that are required by researchers around the university that maybe they don't want to publish yet, but maybe they've created data, added value to them, and they're happy to share them with their colleagues. We have over 2,500 active Lab Archives users now, and so that's continuing to grow. So one of the other things that we did was last year, and this was kind of a follow-up to the APARD meetings that we had attended, we realized we needed to get a better handle on what our colleagues actually needed. And we sent a data needs survey to over 4,300 ASU personnel. Our primary target audience was the faculty and staff researchers, which at ASU is about 2,000 people. But we also included our postdocs and graduate students just because there were some attitudinal questions in the survey and we thought it would be interesting to hear from them. We got a reasonable response for an unsolicited survey. We had over 800 participants. And this is just a couple of highlights which I think are relevant to where we're trying to go. One of the things we realized there was a significant pent-up demand for technology support and data science services. And we also identified that our colleagues, most of them, depending on the cost, would be willing to budget for those services in a research grant. And therefore, there was a potential opportunity and responsibility for the university to develop services in that space that would help facilitate research. This was one that was also interesting. A large number of the respondents in the survey felt that their research project should be retained indefinitely. That's an interesting challenge for any repository and for institutions that provide repositories for their personnel, is that if their expectation is these things are going to be preserved indefinitely, that becomes a cost challenge to the university or the repository. And then a willingness to share data. It was curious that even in this day and age, 7 years after the OSTP memo came out, there are still a small number of our colleagues who don't think they have a responsibility to share their data with anybody. And then in terms of data publishing concerns, some folks felt they were uncomfortable with the idea of putting their data products into an open data repository. And we asked them why that might be the case. And generally it revolved around, one, an assurance that when their data are used, they would get appropriate credit. And secondly, getting an identifier that they could use to demonstrate to their funding agency that they had met their expectations and met their commitments. This is something that I maintain. It's more of a communication tool. I tend to review it every 6 months or so. And basically, when I took on this role, I looked at our research data management landscape and tried to identify where we were doing things well and where we still needed to make improvements. This is a subjective graph, but it's based on the principle of where we're doing things in a sustainable way, where we're developing services or support, where we may just be exploring how we should do that, and where there's a complete gap where things are needed. And so most recently that changed. We improved our data publishing. That's now sustainable with our institutional repository. We are building out our training efforts, and we're starting to take an institutional approach towards research data acquisition and data set management. So I'm not sure if you're aware, but ASU has been voted #1 in the US for innovation, ahead of MIT and Stanford for 6 years on the trot. So I guess that provides us with an innovation opportunity. And I believe the opportunities for us and other institutions is that no one has actually solved the research data management challenge yet. There's lots of good work going on, but we can't really point to anyone and say this has been taken care of. There is no clear process standard for data publication. There's lots of things like metadata standards, but there's no real kind of standard process that somebody should go through or can be advised to go through when it comes to data publishing. There's lots of research data repositories out there. There's discipline-based ones, there's institutional ones, and it's difficult for a researcher to know, what that looks like for their particular role. Many institutions know what needs to be done, but not how to do it. And I think the guide that is coming out of the APARD exercise, I think is going to be a great enabler to help institutions better understand how they might tackle this challenge. The funding agencies are looking for leadership in this area. Toby alluded to this. There's no real common federal guidance yet. The agencies are getting their act together, but these things take time. And we acknowledge that there are pockets of excellence which we can learn from and improve on. And in my experience from business, I am an absolute hater of reinventing the wheel. So if I can find colleagues and collaborators that are already doing things, I know that there are some things that we're doing well that we're happy to share with them, and we're happy to take lessons from other institutions and improve on those. So our priorities at ASU certainly are creating a research data solutions team. We're going through that process at the moment. We're hiring. I mentioned the increased investment in personnel, and we're bringing that team on board. We're aiming to get in very early at the pre-proposal stage of a research grant so that we can provide consulting and make sure that our colleagues take the right steps to manage and preserve their data and publish it at the end of the project. We're collaborating with Penn State on data needs. We've actually produced a data needs form, which is intended to be used at that pre-proposal stage, that really just asks a researcher to start thinking about their technology needs at the beginning of a project and how they might manage those data. That, we believe, will give us a trigger in order to start a dialogue with them and to get started with the conversation. We're collaborating with our sister universities in Arizona, with Northern Arizona University and the University of Arizona, trying to come up with an ABOR-wide, the Arizona Board of Regents, so basically an Arizona-wide data policy. Again, lots of organizations and institutions tackle this individually, but the reality of it is we're all actually trying to solve the same problem, and therefore the more that we can collaborate, the more I believe we'll actually reach a successful conclusion. And we're developing training curriculum for academic and vocational training. One of the things that we concluded, I concluded as an information manager working with the LTR project, was that there was a generation of researchers that we were never really going to convince that they should share their data. We had it, we would sometimes have to claw the data from their cold, dead fingers in order to actually get it published as part of the LTR commitment. And so our academic training focuses on our graduate students. We have a class that is aimed at graduate students, which we've been running now for several years, and we're just about to get our permanent catalogue number for that class. But we also run the software carpentries workshops, and we run vocational training for our researchers on how to get the best out of our research computing facility. So lots of institutions do that, I'm sure, and again, we have no desire to reinvent the wheel, so we're always talking to our colleagues at other universities as to how we can do that better and how we can do that together. And so I'm going to add an extra box to that graph that I showed, to that graphic that I showed you earlier, and that is discard. The idea of determining the long-term value setting a retention period and actually deleting research data if that's appropriate. Discard, delete, destroy, that is kind of the elephant in the room. Nobody really wants to talk about it. We have this panacea that we would love to actually preserve our research data forever, but that may not actually be appropriate or realistic. And so we have to have that conversation, but maybe that's a topic for another day. And in the meantime, all I would suggest is whoever you talk to about this topic, please encourage them to keep calm and publish data.
Thank you, Philip.
I'll hand back to Ian and we can maybe have a discussion on the topic.
Absolutely. Thank you very much indeed for that. Lots of questions being sparked in my head and comments coming through in the chat as well. I'm going to start with one which was passed on through back channels, actually, because I think it touches quite pertinently on your very last point. Someone made the comment that a process that's rarely acknowledged is the maintenance of those data. Non-trivial and largely unresourced. How do we get that on the radar? From your talk, obviously it is on the radar because you've been involved in getting those processes in place. But could you say maybe a bit about the sort of budgetary issues associated with that in terms of how easy it has been to get those recognized, for the sort of preservation that's going on now? And I guess there seemed to be a subtext to your final comment there that it may not be sustainable to keep all these things forever, but is this going to get easier or harder? And is there, I guess, thoughts on helping make that case stronger for unlocking the resources that are necessary for the data preservation longer term?
Sure, absolutely. And I'm sure there are people on the call who are involved with repositories who could maybe speak to this better. I did do an exercise with some colleagues a few years ago where we were looking at the return on investment of research data and research data in repositories. And it has the potential to be really, really valuable. And having worked on ecological projects for a number of years, the data sets tend to be small, so maybe that's not such a challenge. But one of the things with ecological data sets is every single one is a baseline. And you can never recreate it because it's a moment in time, and ecosystems are changing all the time. And I'm sure there are other scientific and research disciplines where we might say that a certain volume of data has to be preserved almost for historical context. And storage is getting cheaper all the time. But one of the things that I always say to people, it's fine that you can have 7 terabytes this year and 10 terabytes next year, but do you know what you have, and do you know where it is, and is it properly organized, and is it properly documented? And an example I would give, which is the one we give to our students, if I have 2 sets of plant growth records and I tell you they were collected on 5/12/2016, here in the US that's the 12th of May, but for you, Ian, that's the 5th of December. So those growth records are going to look very, very different. And therefore the level of detail at which I need to document those data is literally down to what is the date format, what units am I using? Because if I don't do that, there's an opportunity for somebody to misinterpret the data. So that combination of data and metadata and the cost of storing it, I don't think we really understand that yet. And it's very difficult to determine.
That actually chimes with a comment I've just seen about it's one thing to get the data set into the repository, it's another thing to have it documented so it is useful. And I think that my cursory glance across a sort of range of repositories, I've seen that to be a challenge. And it's how we move away from just someone putting something in a repository to tick a box for their funder or their publisher rather than actually doing this meaningfully. If I could just sort of channel part of that question over to you, Toby, and maybe get you to say something about any reflections you've got on the challenges of getting financial commitment from institutions to providing the resources to be able to do this properly.
I mean, the challenge with the financial resources is who has them and where do they come from? So, and particularly that's going to be even a bigger challenge given some of the financial challenges we're facing post-pandemic. But I think the first is getting the commitment. I think it's also important to recognize, it was a question in the chat about funders, and I think that funding piece of the infrastructure, we've got to work out and talk a little bit with the federal agencies about how much how important is this to research that they're going to help pay for it as part of grants. Now you always get into challenges because the researchers themselves don't want money going to the data access. They want it to going to their research. But if we feel this is important for science, it's got to, this is not going to be inexpensive by any means to do this and to make this change. I think there's where our institutions are really grappling with, and I know that our colleagues at the Council on Government Relations, if you're familiar with them, and FD, the Federal Demonstration Partnership, are looking at the costs involved in data access, because we just don't get, right now we don't have a good handle on what that's going to be.
Thank you. So one thought that occurred to me, and as you're talking, and I noticed, Philip, in one of your charts that you had embedded data stewards, and what that sparked in me is the question of who are we targeting here in terms of. I think sometimes it's never quite clear to me is whether the researchers need to be changing what they're doing, or the institutions need to be creating the atmosphere, the environment and the incentives for the researchers to change. Could you say something about that balance of responsibilities?
Sure. And as I say, I apologize again, there may be some background noise, but one of the things that I think is necessary is for us to create the environment. And that's why I mentioned that changing behavior almost comes last, because we do have to create an environment where, one, it's encouraged to do it. Two, we try and make it as easy as possible for our colleagues. I almost included in my presentation today ASU's research data handling matrix. And the only reason I intended to include it, because it's an example of what we shouldn't be doing. It's an incredibly complex matrix where ultimately the researcher still has to decide and make the value decision about how they're going to store their data and how they're going to manage it. And we have to make those kind of processes as simple as possible. We have to give as much guidance without burdening the researcher with 2 volumes to read. So it has to be structured guidance. And we have to provide them with the tools and processes necessary so that they can do it effectively. My honest belief is if we do those things, then the change in behavior comes easier. If we teach the next generation, then it becomes part of the culture. And that's what we're doing with our graduate class is, we're training the next generation of scientists. Okay. I'm not going to keep harping on to that professor emeritus that he needs to publish that 50-year-old data set. No. We're moving on to the next generation.
Yeah. And just one quick note on that, there are some comments in the chat there about curricula and stuff that's out there, which I think was pertinent to one of your comments there about wanting to sort of learn from other places. So worth taking a look. Philip Rubin has his hand up, presumably to ask a question. So Philip.
Yeah, my question was also in the chat. Hi, everybody. I'm the president-elect of FABS and also was formerly at OSTP. My question, is want to make sure that regarding data sharing that we're doing everything possible towards combating bias in data, and second, towards increasing public trust in data sharing. So looking more broadly beyond the universities, we need to think about the public that's served by the money that they pay for this research. I know that you guys all care about that, but I'd like to make sure that stuff like that is highlighted. Thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Right, and Sarah Nusser has hand up as well.
Yes, thanks very much. I just wondered whether, Philip, you can talk a little bit about whether you have a loop that looks at the quality of the data before it's shared, or whether information is protected before it's shared. I think this is a pretty difficult area for institutions to consider. Just wondering if you have experience with that.
We have limited experience, Sarah. We know it needs to be done. I picked up a job as a result of the pandemic this last year. I am now a HIPAA privacy officer because ASU created a secure research environment for health data as part of the public surveillance effort. And I had to go away and Google that to find out what it was and then do the training. But it did help me to really understand that there was a class of data that needed to be highly protected. As I say, I come from life sciences. My graduate research was urban birds of prey. and those data are as public as you want them to be. You know, there's no reason to hide those. But of course, other types of data, human subjects data, health data, are data that we really need to protect. So I mentioned the data handling matrix. We are reworking that at the moment to provide a much more structured guidance to our colleagues to make sure that they make the proper storage choice for their research data. So that's the active research phase. Our colleagues at the library spend a lot of time talking to the researchers who want to publish their data about the fact that it needs to be published in a way that doesn't compromise anybody's privacy. I think we do a reasonable job, but I don't think we're not the leading edge of this stuff, Sarah. That's, I guess, the best way I can put it.
Yeah, thank you.
If I can just make Ian, can I make a quick comment on that? Because this gets to a question in the chat about security of data. And as I said, that's a growing issue. And I raise it because I do think we need to increase awareness of faculty, not only about the importance of making data open, but what data does need to be protected for whatever reason that is. Privacy, sometimes it's security. And I think we've often referred to data management plans in the context, and faculty look at them as, this is how I talk about how I make my data open. We need to integrate into that. This is also where you talk about data that needs to be protected and get faculty to think about things, because we know there are increased concerns about data being sensitive, and we have the National Archives and Records Administration. People think the National Archives, is where they store store important U.S. documents, but they also oversee any government documents and information. And so they have a controlled unclassified information registry of things that need to be protected. Much of that is related to data. We need to educate faculty, and our institutions need to get up to speed so that those can be incorporated into data management plans correctly, and data can be protected as well as made open.
Okay. Thank you for that comment. And there, I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap this up because we've come to the top of the hour. I think that this sparked a really interesting discussion in the chat, certainly about what it is important to preserve and for how long, whether it be the data, the raw data, the models, the algorithms, all those sorts of things. So I think between you've opened up a topic for possibly a future seminar. So thank you both very much indeed for bringing those perspectives, which I think have been very valuable to the wider community. It remains for me to thank everybody else for participating and joining us, and hoping that you will join us at the next seminar, which is scheduled for the 7th of May, where we're going to have 2 speakers talking about the areas of data discovery and interoperability. Michelle Heacock, who's going to be talking about initiatives within the NIHS, which I believe is looking at sort of how you kind of handle whole ranges of health data, and Danny Kincaid will be giving us a oceanographic perspective on this particular topic. So we look forward to that. And once again, thank you to Toby, Philip, to people behind the scenes for organising this. And we look forward to seeing you again at a future webinar. Enjoy the rest of your day.